Welcome, everybody, to our Thursday film camp with Joel Gunz, and I'm Tammy Klein, and I'm your hostess this evening. Thank you for joining us, and I hope everybody had a great 4th of July weekend, even though it's almost the weekend now. It's Thursday. I'm not going to talk too much. I want Joel to go ahead and say hello, and I know we have an amazing lesson tonight. And then at the end, we can take your questions and answers, as well as Joel will go over what to expect on his next featured lecture. Thank you, Joel, for coming tonight.
Thanks for having me. All right, can I just jump right in and start talking?
Absolutely, right, everybody? Make sure everybody can hear okay?
Okay, well, I'm going to...
Yes.
Great.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to share my screen and get right to it.
Perfect.
So they don't make them like they used to. A few years ago, the Atlantic Monthly assembled a panel of historians to compile a list of the 50 greatest breakthroughs since the wheel. And my PowerPoint is frozen up. Apparently they don't make PowerPoints like they used to. There we go, let's try that. And so you can expect, you could have predicted what might show up on that list. The airplane got number 15 on this 50 greatest breakthroughs. Penicillin, number 28, makes sense, saved a lot of lives. Personal computers ranked number 16 on the greatest breakthroughs. Sure, okay, got it. That's all due cred. Gutenberg's printing press snagged the #1 slot on the 50 greatest breakthroughs since the wheel. And what did motion pictures get? Nothing. Not a darn thing. And I have a problem with that, because by photographically capturing motion for repeatable playback, film introduced something absolutely new to the world, and something that humans have been aspiring for at least 20,000, if not 40,000 years. Here's a picture of the caves of Lascaux in France. 20,000 years before Mickey Mouse, people would go into these caves with their flickering torches and watch these animals come to life in a simulation of animation. And in the centuries and millenniums since then, they've tried to get closer and closer. They created writing 5,000 years ago. That's a newcomer, really. And all along, they've been thinking about how to bring to life their visual ideas. Gutenberg's printing press was invented around 1450. And so it's really a Johnny-come-lately. And when you compare what the printing press did with what motion pictures did, I have to scratch my head, because these aspirations, these visual animated aspirations, were something that we have literally dreamed about for most of our evolution. Writing, again, is a Johnny-come-lately. And really, what did Gutenberg's press do for us, especially in the beginning? Not as much as you'd think. The generally accepted theory is that printing literature made literature available at cheap rates for the masses right off the bat. But the rest of the story is a little bit more complicated and a lot less flattering for Gutenberg's invention. So let's take a look at this, because the first 100 years of the existence of the printing press parallels in certain ways the first half century of motion pictures. Because his books were kind of a tough sell at first. The press and the books that came from it, they didn't really fly off the shelf. Customers didn't know what to make of the new technology, and they just looked askance at his strange machine. The survival of the printing press was far from assured. As Daniel Boorstin writes in one of my favorite books, The Discoverers, that in 15th century Europe, innovation itself was kind of an unheard of idea, and it was viewed with suspicion. People were pretty traditional back then. After all, Knowledge was not considered a right of all mankind, but a privilege for the few. And so creating mass-produced books just didn't make sense. People wanted to hoard that knowledge for themselves. And this wealthy upper class, they were bound by tradition. They were very conservative. They weren't exactly a group of early adopters. In fact, even after the Gutenberg press was invented, publishers didn't really see it as a tool to disseminate knowledge. After all, if they'd really seen that potential in it, they probably would have suppressed it even more. But instead, they just saw it as a way to efficiently recreate handwriting. And so to that generation, just like me and my kids trying to teach me about Snapchat or TikTok or Flip Flap or whatever new social media platform is out there, they just didn't get it. And they had a hard time understanding what it was all about. Early publishers went to great lengths to accommodate their customers' taste for handwritten books. And so that's why these old Gutenberg Bibles and other publications, they're lavishly hand illustrated. They would even go in and distress the text itself to give it more of a handmade look, to make it, to imitate the sort of human look of a hand-scribed book. But the implications of all those efforts were pretty obvious, that the handmade originals were superior to the newfangled printed books. They were just a shoddy knockoff. It may have been the first time in history when people said they don't make them like they used to. And so it was a catch-22, because there was no mass market available for books. These printed books, even though they were slightly cheaper than the handmade versions, they were still astronomically expensive and just completely out of the reach of the 99% of other people who might have wanted to read them. And on the other hand, the wealthy who could easily afford the real version, the handmade version, well, they had a noble obligation to their local scribes to keep them employed. So books had a hard time, and the printing press had a hard time getting going. But it did, it got some traction, and the scribes started pushing back. And in fact, the first book bans had nothing to do with morals or forbidden knowledge, and they had everything to do with job preservation. So the world had to wait for another 400 years, the 19th century, for mechanized printing to come into play. Mass production. And from that perspective, then, the Industrial Revolution should be credited for the spread of printed books, and literacy, not so much Gutenberg's innovation. So his ideas and his press did change all sorts of his social equations, but in fact, it really only happened in Europe, and only among those at the top of the food chain. And then it took an awfully long time for printing to gain ground. By contrast, we've got film. So here it is. This is the world's first cat video, filmed by Edward Muybridge in 1887. He's generally regarded as the father of moving pictures. And film was different from the printing press and books. It changed everything. We're going to get into that, but first let's talk about how much it was, in those early days, was like printing. Like Gutenberg's press, motion pictures were dismissed by the educated folk. It was a cheap, less sophisticated alternative to live theater. A lot of those early films were, frankly, softcore pornography. And it wasn't until film evolved a language of its own, montage, close-up, editing, that kind of thing, that anybody would take it seriously as an art form. But even then, the perception stuck. But its impact on the world cannot be overstated. Compare it to meteors, meteoric rising, compare it to rockets, compare it to a flock of cheetahs let loose in a field. Gutenberg's books, his motion pictures, unlike Gutenberg's books, motion pictures were practically an overnight, round-the-world success. They were a true phenomenon. Even the barest of stories, or even no story, had audiences lined up around the block to go see them, cramming into whatever makeshift auditorium they could find. And that was just the beginning. You could set up a camera in front of a factory and just film people walking out of work at the end of the day, show that film later on in the night, and you'd have a sold out auditorium. Or you could set up a film on a train station and watch an incoming train come in and have audiences gasping in terror and delight as the train appeared to lunge out of the screen at them. Or they would put the camera on the train or a trolley and just travel around the city, and people would watch these tours of their own city on film when they could just as easily just board a trolley and take the same ride. It was magic. But overall, people thought of it as just a gimmick or a diversion, a sideshow, like the vaudeville and magic acts that occupied the exhibition stalls next to it at a carnival. That's why early on, one of the founders of cinema, Louis Lumière, said, "Cinema is an invention without a future." He could have been one of those patricians 400 years earlier saying that the printing press is an invention without a future. But eventually they started telling stories. And then that became a problem because then cinema began competing with the theater and even shooting films of well-known plays. In fact, in some areas in film in London and other film centers, audiences had a choice. On Saturday night, they could go to see a live play and let's say Juno and the Peacock. And then on Sunday night, they could go back to that same theater and watch the film version of that play starring the same actors, Juno and the Peacock, for far cheaper. So it was a very strange, almost a surreal time in history. And what did people say when they compared these black and white silent movies to the rich acting and the presence of actors? Well, with the advent of cinema competing with theater, they said they don't make them like they used to. But that was going to change because one of the most crucial aspects of film is its amazing visual richness. And it wasn't hampered by language. And when you stop and think about it, what was a film? But it was people acting, and then every once in a while, a dialogue title card would pop on the screen to tell you what they're saying. Then we're back to the film. Well, you could take that film and export it around the world very quickly, and then local theater managers would just cut out those English titles and replace them with Hungarian or Japanese or Afrikaans or whatever the local language was. And that movie was instantly transported from its point of manufacturer anywhere in the world, easily understandable by local audiences. In fact, it is said that within 25 years of Edison's first commercial exhibition in 1894, practically everyone on Earth had seen a movie. And so that's a problem for books because even today, literacy is still not universal, but movies and video and film are. So that's why I think that motion pictures deserve a lot more credit than Gutenberg's printing press. Sorry, Atlantic Monthly. Books never had it so good or so easy. And so that's why I question the notion of the good old days. And however, there were amazing things happening. And at that time, film was gaining global recognition. And we see this even in the logos of many of the film production companies. So there's RKO's Globe. There's the original Universal Films logo from 1914, I believe. And there's the original Paramount Pictures logo with that mountain that seems to cap and have a view of the entire world. But things were changing quickly. And in those years, there was so much experimentation going on that it's just really worth talking about. So you had, for example, in 1914, 1918, the Dadas, the Dadaists, exploded on the scene, and that morphed into surrealism. And so Man Ray, the photographer, was one of the first to embrace not only photography, but film as an art form. This is his Emak Bakia from 1926. And that's him at the camera. So he's the director of the film, also making a cameo appearance in his own film. And this is a shot that explores the notion of the gaze and of the reflexivity. We see his eye represented in the lens at the center of that shot. Meanwhile, we're gazing back at his eye, you could say, traveling through the tubes of that projector right back into his brain. And so he's exploring those notions of reflexivity and metatext. Then you had another Dadaist, Marcel Duchamp, and this is his film Anemic Cinema from 1926. And the film is just a series of abstract shapes and spirals twirling and spinning and flipping around in front of the eye. It's pure abstraction. And that's how he was conceiving of film. At the same time, of course, you had the most famous surrealist film by Salvador Dali and Luis Buñuel, Un Chien Andalou, 1929. And they recognized that the possibilities were endless in how to make a film. But there's just one problem, that making movies is quite expensive, and you need to turn a profit if you're going to make them. And that profit motive squelched creativity. So all these crazy ideas, as the industry matured, no longer flew. You had to have a bankable idea that before people would finance your film. And that meant that it squelched creativity, and it created a creative conservatism that challenged the imagination of filmmakers. In addition to that, you had in Hollywood and other filmmaking centers around the world, a heavy scrutiny of the morals of the producers and actors and directors and so forth, and of the content in the films themselves. And so in 1934, famously, the Hays Code was put in place, and it restricted all kinds of themes, not just what you would expect, such as explicit sex or violence or hard language, but anything that put the Catholic Church in a negative light was off the table. Of course, homosexuality and lesbian, gay, bi, trans, queer representations were not allowed. Interracial relationships were forbidden from being portrayed on the screen. So it's like the historian Thomas Doherty said, that the guilty are punished, the virtuous must be rewarded, the authority of church and state must be legitimized, and the bonds of matrimony must be made sacred. Now that sounds like a pretty ideal world that we might all want to live in, but it doesn't reflect the real world that we do live in. And art, true art, has been reflective of reality and the real world we live in, and not some polemic fantasy. So here's one example. This is Howard Hughes's The Outlaw, starring Jane Russell. And after he made it in 1939, 1940, it took him 3 years to fight the board to get this released publicly, and mainly because they didn't like the poster. I don't know why. I like it. But anyway, film quickly became a genre industry. And this is when we enter into the classic era of film, the 1930s through the 1950s. But these were all genre films. You had your basic melodrama, you had your comedy, you had your musical, and of course you had your bad boy of film, film noir. And I mean, don't get me wrong, this is my personal favorite period of film history. I love it. But I have to say, it was creatively constrained in ways that ultimately damaged its potential at that time. So let's take a look at this top grossing films of 1947. The number one top ranking film of 1947 was Welcome Stranger. Have you heard of it? I haven't. The Egg and I? Nope. Unconquered, Life with Father, Forever Amber. I don't know these movies. No, The Bachelor and the Bobby Soxer with Cary Grant, absolutely. Road to Rio, Bob Hope and Bing Crosby, sure. Green Dolphin Street, love the song. Mother Wore Tights, hilarious. But at least half these movies have really not stood the test of time. Not necessarily that they're bad, but they've just been forgotten. And so what I'd like to suggest is that when we're looking back at a classic period of any time, it's possible that we tend to remember the best and then forget the rest. And so the good old days aren't always as good as we thought they were. And therefore, we may not always want to make them like they used to. These genre films ended up, they started looking alike. The characters were interchangeable, the plots and the stories were pretty interchangeable. And that's not always good. It can just sort of munge together into overall, except for a few standouts, just one blurry continuity. So by the 60s, censorship started to slip. You know, the Hayes office under William Breen didn't have the power that it had. Exhibitors were demanding more range in their content. They were losing audiences, and so they were defying the film code. And so people were looking for ways to come up with, to get around all those restrictions. And on the surface of it, we might think that that's not such a good thing, because who wants, you know, as adults, do we really want more explicit sex and violence on the screen? That's a double-edged sword, as we know. But at the same time, we did want to see more creative expression. And finally, in 1960, it all comes back to, of course, my boy Alfred Hitchcock, who defied the production code and released Psycho. And it was a huge hit, and it was absolutely history making in terms of its sexuality and implied nudity, the violence, of course, of the shower scene. And some of you might already know this, but I love this story anyway, that Psycho was the first time that a real, you know, motion picture for public consumption contained an image of a flushing toilet. And so with this deterioration of the power of that censorship board, they were finally able to start exploring themes such as gay themes and interracial marriage. They were also able to shine a light on religious or governmental abuse in ways that they were restricted from doing before. In other words, they stopped making them like they used to. And there were some costs, but I think we would all also agree that overall there were real benefits to that. So over the last 30 years, our brains have also, well, I'd say half century, our brains have begun evolving to embrace new ways of making films and new ways of consuming films. That old classic film literacy, shot, reaction shot, reverse shot, has been replaced by all sorts of new ways to model a film. And so those avant-garde films that we talked about from Marcel Duchamp and Man Ray and Salvador Dali, those avant-garde methods surged in the last, I'd say, 25 years, and they're blossoming. So here are just a few examples. David Lynch, he's one of my favorite filmmakers. And he dug deep and drank deeply from that well of surrealism from Salvador Dali and Luis Buñuel and many others to create a particular kind of irony where the macabre and the violent sort of metastasize inside of a Norman Rockwell scenario. And so he shows us how our bland, normal American lives actually can often contain a real horror. But his films are weird and they're hard to watch and the plots are really confusing. Back in the day, David Selznick would have had David Lynch lynched. Then, of course, you got Christopher Nolan, who's just been a powerhouse for the last quarter century. He makes these mind-bending, time-traveling, weird films that mess around with the space-time continuum, and he produces them as big-budget summer blockbusters. How does he do it? Those blockbusters are usually the most conservative spaces in Hollywood. But then there's Christopher Nolan. And so you have, for instance, Memento from, I think it's 2002. It's about a guy whose memory gets wiped clean every night. And so he's got to tattoo himself with messages about the things he's got to remember. And watching the film, we go forward, you jump back and forth in time so frequently that it's really hard to keep up. We feel what it's like to be that character. Then there's Inception, came out just a couple of years ago, spy thriller about going inside someone's dreams to steal information. And by the end of the movie, you're unclear about what is dream and what is reality, which raises all kinds of philosophical questions. And then, of course, you got Tenet, came out last summer, about a secret agent who learns to manipulate the flow of time to prevent an attack from the future that threatens to annihilate the present world. And again, it jumps back and forth in time and twists, make for really difficult viewing. It's the kind of film that just would not have been accepted. It would have been thrown out of the script room 40 years ago. And then there's Darren Aronofsky. And he's got a unique surrealist take, I'd say, on the whole Judeo-Christian mythology. And so his film Pi, which came out in 1998, was a huge hit. All of these films have been hits. But a mathematician with an obsession to find underlying complete order in the real world, and it contrasts two seemingly irreconcilable entities: imperfect, rational humanity and the rigor and regularity of mathematics. Tough film to watch. You have to watch it a couple times just to understand what he's getting at. And it was also one of the biggest hits of the year. In 2006, he came out with The Fountain. And this is a blend of fantasy, history, spirituality, science fiction. Hugh Jackman and Rachel Weisz play three sets of characters bonded by love across time and space. It's a meditation of life, love, immortality, and the afterlife, and there's no way it would have been made 50 years ago. 2017, he came out with the film Mother, and it follows a young woman whose tranquil country life with their husband is disrupted and eventually destroyed. It's really a metaphor for the biblical creation and apocalypse stories, and maybe climate change too. Again, that would have been banned under the old studio system. And this is why I think that we are now in the golden era of film. For example, here's one of the contributing factors. Here's a film set from the 1950s, and that's probably a Technicolor camera up in the top left. Giant monstrosity. It's probably got 3 strips of film running through it that will be blended together to make the Technicolor film when it's complete. Those giant heavy lights that have to be lugged around, a massive crew to keep it all running. Making a movie just to get a good exposure and get good footage was a huge, costly, massive industrial undertaking. You compare that with a hit film that was shot last year, and this is all they needed. A tiny camera that you could pull it right off of its stand there and carry it on your shoulder. They were able to work in natural light, which is something that old film processes couldn't pull off. And it's just a skeleton crew by contrast. That's all you need to make a movie. In my own case, all of my own films, I shoot them right here on my iPhone. And I edit them using desktop software, and it's awesome. And so that that lower cost of entry, the cheapness that you can make a film with. Also the exhibition costs are lower because instead of worrying about whether or not I'm going to fill up an auditorium, I can upload my movie to YouTube or Vimeo, and it's there for the whole world to see. And so all of these factors mean that more people can make more film than ever. And it gives people who have massive talent an entry that they might not have had before. So that's why I think we're in a golden era of cinema. I mean, to be honest, I can't keep up with all the movies that are coming out, and then all the streaming content on Netflix and Amazon Prime, etc. It's as the science fiction writer Philip K. Dick once said, that the symbols of the divine initially show up at the trash stratum. And a good way to think about this is, where do we search for diamonds? We search for them in the earth, in the dirt, right? That's where we find our most valuable minerals. But he's saying that even across all art, we're going to find our best ideas, our best thinking, our best art actually in the trash of the world. So let's think of some good examples of that. So you've got, for example, printed books. Getting back to Gutenberg. Again, printing was considered a cheap knockoff of the real thing, of handmade books. But eventually those low production costs of printing allowed more writers to enter the field and to build their own audience. And so in the last couple of 100 years, there's been an explosion in literature, right? And I think that my bookcase is better off having some Pound, some Ezra Pound, some Ernest Hemingway, some T.C. Boyle on it, because all of these writers are working what people once thought was that trash stratum. In the 1910s and 1920s, film and cinema was considered cheap, lowbrow entertainment. But this is the exact soil where Hitchcock, Fritz Lang, Cecil B. DeMille took root and created some of the most transcendent art of the last 100 years. So what's today's trash stratum? I'd say it's quite possibly YouTube or Vimeo or Facebook or Instagram. And yes, in these areas, there's a lot of trash. But if you keep close, if you look close and keep poking around in there, you just might find the next Gloria Swanson or Cecil B. DeMille. And that's it. That's all I got.
You end up like, all of a sudden we're like, really? We're done? You got it. You have to keep on going. It's real, I know you just make them up for us, right? Everybody, that's why they are so special, is that Joel creates all his presentations that he has, especially for us. These are, so that's why they just are really engaging, because he literally makes these for us. So thank you for that. Now, is there any questions out there? You can feel free to unmute yourself. Of course, I'm going to let everybody ask their questions before I ask mine. So I hope everybody enjoyed it. So if you need to ask a question, just unmute yourself or hold down the space bar. But Joel, what do you think about what really, I guess, irks me with all of these movies right now are the CG, the green screens, all the movies that are created, in a studio that aren't even out in the real world anymore. I mean, they're literally like, I always take the Avengers movies. I've seen all they have is a couple little props in front of them, and everything is in green screen, and that's what I feel like when they say they don't make them like they used to. I think about how all of a sudden, they're not even on location. They're, the sets and stuff like that. It's all created by the computer. So what is your take on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and it's valid. I don't even watch, I can't even watch the Marvel movies anyway, because I think it's just, you know, I don't shop at Walmart either for the same reason I don't shop at Walmart. It's like, you know, there's better business out there, and I like a smaller business and a more real, authentic business. And I think like a good comparison is when in 1929, silent film was replaced with sound. And the lament with that transition was that all of a sudden, all this amazing creativity that was happening in the 20s got sort of squelched and shut down, and movies just became pictures of people talking, as Hitchcock liked to say. And or you know, it was that musicals, which is fine, but they weren't cinema anymore. They were just pictures of people talking. And so what happens every time a new technology is introduced, it sort of takes over, and the technology starts running the art rather than the art using the technology, you know, to produce something better. And same thing happened when Technicolor came out. All of a sudden, all the costumes, the, you know, lipstick had to be bright red, and the costumes had to be brightly colored, and you know, it was just this visual explosion. And it took a while for color film to get back to the idea that they should just show the real world in its natural color and let that, you know, sort of carry the art. And so I think what's been happening with the CG thing, and it's been going on for what, maybe 15 years, that there are all these films that use CG, and you kind of sense that you're watching something that's fake in its artifice. What's an interesting thing that's been happening with some of these films, like The Dark Knight and the Star Wars. That's what I was getting to. So when they rebooted the Star Wars franchise a couple years ago, they started using practical effects, and they got away from this CG green screen, you know, nonsense. And and so I think when we look at the big picture, and if we could look back on this time 50 years from now, I think what we're going to see is we're going to look back and see that, yeah, CG kind of whipped us around for a while, but we got back to our real values, which is presenting, you know, an authentic performance in an authentic setting.
Another question I might have also is, you know, people talk about film wars and Citizen Kane, and you know, that's like a lot of people talk about when you think about Hollywood and classic films. And you know, there's film studies and lectures. I know, you know, in college, I was a film, you know, major,
Yeah.
and but that's what we studied. So, and then taking it back to, you know, we always was comparing and contrasting, you know, like Heart of Darkness and Apocalypse Now, and you know, all of that other. Um, what? How are they using the history of film and the film noir and the classic? How are they comparing it? I mean, like, so what is the catch? Like, why do people still? Is it just a nostalgic? I mean, what do people look for now comparing the two?
That's, I think there is some nostalgia in there. But you know, those classics like Citizen Kane, for example, or Hitchcock's Vertigo, you know, they I think they fall into the category of Shakespeare. In other words, I think these are immortal. I think we'll be watching these movies in 200 years. And and I also think that there are movies that are being made right now that will be watched in 200 years. And it can be hard to recognize them because they're so close to home. You know, we don't know what kind of shelf life they've got. But for example, I would guess, my prediction, heard it here first, is that Christopher Nolan's Memento will also be watched in 200 years. Um, and so I think, you know, that it's rather than in looking at like this classic era as like the peak of a bell curve, what I see in looking at studying films from every decade is maybe it's more like this. And every decade has its high points and its low points and its unforgettable moments and totally forgettable moments. So
Do you think the physiological, the thrillers that were then and now, are they running about the same, the psychological thrillers that are out there, with Hitchcock and some of the ones today? How would you compare the ones back then and now?
well, there are a couple of that's a philosophical question. And okay, so here's the higher level answer. I think some of these found footage films like Paranormal Activity um, have a real have a currency that means more now than it would have even meant 50 years ago. So for those of you who haven't seen Paranormal Activity, these are horror films, and the conceit of these films is that somebody has set up a camera in a room. Maybe it's a surveillance camera, and every once in a while, in that camera, you watch a little ghosty thing make something go bump, and the entire film, for the most part, is just watching these people act through a surveillance camera. And so the reason a horror film like that works, and I think it works very well, is there's not a lot of violence. There's not a lot of anything that would be, morally objectionable, really. But they really grip you because you feel like you're watching reality. There's a feeling of watching reality through this surveillance camera. And that ties into, I believe that the reason that works is because we live in a world of social media, and we live in a world that's being surveilled in many ways 24/7. We've got all kinds of concerns working on us that a movie like that probably would have been made 50 years ago might not have even had that much impact. But now, like, it really grabs us because that's what's on our mind. So then we compare that, and so that's a certain type of psychological thriller, because we've got a certain psychology in 2021 that we kind of didn't have in 1961. So then we go back to those classic films, and they're playing on a psychology. On one level, they're playing on Psycho is playing on a 1960 psychology. At the same time, it's also got universal themes that make it really, enjoyable for people today. But Psycho is funny because I have shown it to young people who never saw it and don't know anything about it. And so they're a blank slate, great audience to show it to. And they love it, then they're entertained by it and they get it. But the thrill of the murder scene and all of the other thrills in the movie, they're just doesn't do anything for them. Really doesn't do much for them. Doesn't do what it did to audiences in 1960 who were jumping out of their seat when the shower curtain gets pulled open. So and I don't think that's just a matter of tastes changing or of people being inured to on-screen violence. I really think it has something to do with our psychology. Our generational psychology is in flux. It's always changing, and and so the movies are going to kind of hit us in a different way. Does that answer that?
I do. Yeah, you compared the two. Thank you. I'm out of questions. Everybody, anybody else? Please ask away. Does anybody have a a great film that they remember? Mrs. Fay, I know that you always have some comments. Is there a film that you remember way back then, or what are your comments about how you see films back then and now? You can, how to unmute yourself. I wouldn't mind hearing from any of you that just remembers like going to theater, years ago, and then compare it to the films now. What is your thoughts?
Oh,
Anybody?
and if you're feeling shy,
Can you hear me?
yeah.
Yes, Mr. Kalen.
Yeah, well, I think that in a lot of the films, one like Beau Geste and Four Feathers and things like that, the original version was much more truer to the book, and the subsequent remakes weren't nearly as good as the original. And I don't even know why they decided to remake a lot of these classic films, because I don't know that there's any remake that was nearly as good as the original.
Yeah, amen. Their remakes rarely are. You heard that Psycho was remade, and forget the director's name. He's from my hometown, and I'm just spacing on his name. And the remake with Anne Hesh and Norman Bates is played by an actor whose also name I'm also just forgetting right now.
I got it. I've got it. We've got it. Anne Hetch, and is it Anne Hecheche? It's directed Gus Van Sant and Brian Grazer.
Yeah, Gus Van Sant. And who played Norman?
I'm opening. We've got Vince Vaughn.
Vince
Really?
Vaughn. Yeah, really?
Really?
And so it was.
I'm gonna share my screen while you talk.
Sure. It was a shot by shot remake. So all the dialogue, every shot was the same. It was like 95% the same, but he filmed it in color. And so you got to see the murder in the shower in color instead of black and white, which is kind of a big deal. Everybody agrees that the remake was garbage. It was just a waste of you're gonna get 2 hours of your life you won't get back. I still defend it because I think it's an interesting experiment. And the big thing it did, I think, was just reveal how brilliant and genius the original was. But I think that happens, an original movie is made and they capture lightning in a bottle, and it's a beautiful thing and it cannot be repeated. And so I think sometimes it's a mistake to remake a movie.
There you go. Here's some remakes that are better than the original movie.
Wow. Oh, look at that.
You got the Maltese Falcon, The Stars Born. How many remakes of that?
Yeah, 4, I think. 4 or 5, yeah.
Yeah. Anybody seen some of these remakes?
I think I've seen all of those except An Affair to Remember. The Man Who Knew Too Much, that's a little bit unfair because Hitchcock remade his own movie. I agree that the 1956 version is better, but the 1934 version is quite adorable.
Right. Well, thank you. All right, well, everybody, I think that wraps it up. Now, Joel, do you want to tell them about my favorite, which he's going to, again, customize for us, is on the musicals. I am so excited for this because we are going to have we're going to watch The Greatest Showman out at the pool. And I think that's going to be after perhaps your lecture. But Joel, tell us about what your lecture is going to be about at the end of this month.
Well, okay, so the big question is musicals. What happened? Where did the musical go? And it's actually, we agreed to create this one. I think that's going to be a great topic. But in the last couple of years, we've gotten The Greatest Showman, and then we got Lin-Manuel Miranda's In the Heights that just came out, just a few weeks ago. And, I don't know about you, but I watched it and absolutely adored it and laughed and cried and in all the right places. And so so I'll be exploring the history of musicals, the high point. There was a high water mark, and then they seemed to go away, or at least they never stopped making them, but fewer of them were made than in prior times. And so what happened and why? Why did people stop watching musicals? And what are some else? I'll also be exploring some aspects of, oh my God, that's such an old picture. I need to send you a new one. Tons ago. And so I'll be exploring like music in film as well, just music as an aspect of film, and as just one of the tools in the toolkit of a filmmaker to take audiences on an emotional journey. So hopefully wrap it up in a little bit more film philosophy as well, and discuss not just history, but discuss ideas and things that we can talk about. We can agree. If we want, we can disagree, and that's good too.
Right, and you'll send us a film list so we can, after you're done, and we can have everybody follow up, and I'll send that out to everybody if you'd like.
Yeah.
For the film list, and then we're going to talk about the Coen brothers in August.
Yes, Coen brothers in August. Looking forward to that. So The Man Who Wasn't There, of course, which is one of his lesser known ones, and but it's one of my favorites because again, it's their take on Hitchcock. Fargo, of course. Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Which I might even tease that out as a musical.
Well, that's the way it says. That's the way it. When you click on musical, that does show up for the Coen brothers.
Yeah.
All right. Well, good night, everybody. Thank you, Joel. Enjoy the rest of your night or your day in Montana, and thank you again for everybody for coming.
Okay. Thank you.
Have a good one.
Have a wonderful evening.
All righty. You
Bye-bye.
too. Bye.